Hello, welcome to part three, the unintuitive God from a mortal perspective. So, I've been thinking about this for a while, and yesterday I spoke a little bit about Joseph, and I spoke a little bit about Moses as well. So, let's set the stage here for a second. It's been 400 years since Joseph was around in Egypt. The Israelites have been enslaved, and now their firstborn sons are being killed because they have prospered so much that the Egyptians fear them. And so they've enslaved them. And if you're a writer, and I know that not everybody is, but if you're a writer, if you're a moviegoer, if you are thinking about this story, it's probably a story that you've heard many, many times before. But let's stop and actually consider it. So, what happens? The babies are killed. What kind of story starts with that? So immediately you have this stage set, and it's awful. But then there's this one baby that's saved. And I'm sure that a lot of people go, oh, think about what it costs. His mother has to give up her baby boy. She may never see him again. She puts him in a basket of reeds and sends him down the river. Can you imagine that? This little life that has been nurtured in your womb for 9 months. And you felt him kick, you felt him move, you felt him grow. And you know that he'll be killed. And so in this sacrificial love, you have to let him go. And children are a gift from God. Can you imagine what that's like, having to give up your own child? Of course, we see this a couple of times in the Bible. Hannah does this with Samuel, dedicating a child to the Lord means letting them go. Sometimes it means that you won't have them back. Sometimes God is gracious enough to return them. But the children of Israel, the descendants of Jacob, they're being oppressed, they're in slavery. And so Moses grows up in the court of Pharaoh because Pharaoh's daughter finds this baby amongst the reeds and she takes him in. And he's raised in the royal household. He's raised as an Egyptian. And you might think, well, okay, things are going to look up at this point because you've got the story of Joseph, right? Joseph went through prison, he was a slave, and then he became prime minister. So God has positioned Moses to become maybe the next Pharaoh. Certainly one of his favorite sons or grandsons. Doesn't particularly matter. But the point is, he is a powerful voice in the royal household, right? That's what you would think. If you were writing a story, that's what you might think. Okay, so sacrifice here is awful, but she gives up her baby. Her baby gets raised as a royal prince. But at least, you know, it's a chance for the Israelite people to have a voice. And maybe this guy Moses will actually lead God's people to salvation by putting down equal rights and stuff, convincing the Pharaoh that they're not going to rise up in revolt. I mean, look at the story of Esther, which we will look at later. That's what you'd think, right? But that's not what happens. Moses sees an Egyptian overseer tormenting one of the Hebrews, and then he kills him. Now, you could say he murders him, and maybe, yes. But think about authority. Think about royal authority. The king, or the pharaoh, has the right to execute his subjects. This may not be a very nice fact, we may not like it, but sovereignty in a feudal system allows the king to have life and death over his people. But Moses doesn't actually exercise this, and maybe he doesn't have the right but he's not exactly, shall we say, walking in sonship. He's not exactly modeling Pharaoh. And then his own people turn on him. Are you going to kill us like you killed that Egyptian? Because he's an outsider. He's raised as an Egyptian. He's not one of the Hebrew people, and yet he is. And instead of going to his mother, instead of going to his grandfather and saying, look, this is what happened. Are you going to allow this? He's terrified and he runs away. So immediately we see something of the character of Moses. So he's divided and he's insecure. And maybe this is just me reading into it, but this is what I see. And I'm sure that as I come back to the story years from now, I will see different perspectives. But at this moment in time, that's what I see. I see a scared young man who doesn't know which camp he belongs to. He doesn't know how to walk in authority. And so he runs away. He runs away. He abandons his adoptive family. And he becomes a shepherd. For 40 years, he's in the wilderness, in some desert. And during that time, he finds another guy and that guy's daughter, and they get married. And at some point, there's a bush. So what? And the bush is on fire. Again, so what? But the bush doesn't burn up. And that's when things get interesting. And so Moses goes to investigate. And that's when God speaks to him. And so God up until this point has been silent in the story. He could have interceded at any point. He could have put his hand on Moses' shoulder, even just his finger, and said, hey, calm down. He could have stopped Moses from killing that Egyptian. He could have given Moses the courage to speak. He could have said, go talk to the Pharaoh. But he doesn't. Not yet. And so Moses goes to investigate. And God chooses to speak through nature to Moses. And then he speaks to him directly. And I'm sure you guys know the story. So there's a back and forth between God and Moses. And Moses says, yeah, but I don't have anything. God says, what's in your hand? So I just have this shepherd's staff, this shepherd's crook. That's all he needed. What was in his hand? And so he goes to the court of the Pharaoh. And at some point, there's Aaron, and Moses is saying, yeah, but I can't speak well. Can I take Aaron? Or paraphrasing here. And so we have the sidekick. What a sidekick Aaron is. And so Moses goes to the court of the Pharaoh. Let my people go. And at this point, Moses is the most humble man in all the land. I mean, after 40 years of tending sheep, how could he not be? And that's an interesting parallel between him and David, because David becomes the greatest king of all of Israel. How did David start? He started off as a shepherd. How did Moses start? Well, he started off as a royal prince, but then he became a shepherd because he did not want the pleasures of Egypt. So he goes to the Pharaoh. Pharaoh refuses. And Pharaoh's magicians, they throw their sticks on the ground. Moses throws his stick on the ground. They both become snakes. If you're an observer at this point, you just see sticks becoming snakes. You may not have any idea of what actually is going on, that you don't see these two invisible kingdoms. Why a snake? Why does God use a snake? Remember that the serpent is in the garden. Serpent is a symbol of the enemy, right? And yet God is not afraid to use pagan symbols or pagan imagery as we see it. So Moses' staff becomes a snake. Why doesn't it become a lion? Why doesn't it become anything other than that? And of course, that happened a little earlier because Moses is afraid of his own staff back in the desert when God has him throw it on the ground. So it's not as if God sends Moses in without Moses having any kind of sign, a bit like Gideon. So God gives Moses a sign, and then Moses goes and delivers the message, and then throws his stick on the ground, and it becomes a snake again. It eats up the other snakes. And you would think that maybe Pharaoh might start listening, but he won't. And the scripture even says that God hardens Pharaoh's heart. So the question is, how are we going to interpret this? Does it mean that Pharaoh's heart was full of pride and he had already hardened his heart towards God and God had simply given him free will? Or does it mean that God had overridden Pharaoh's free will and chosen to harden his heart? Maybe it's both. But we do know that the wages of sin are death. So, if that's the case, Pharaoh keeps on refusing. And then the 10 plagues come along. And it cultivates with the Egyptians' firstborn sons being killed. And at that point, it's an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life. Because remember Moses? Yeah, all of the Hebrew boys were being killed. And yet somehow Aaron was around and so were others. But it does sound like population control through genocide, if you actually read what the scriptures say. Anyway, so the Egyptians actually let them go. They let them leave, and they give them stuff. They give them gold, they give them silver, they give them fine cloth. 400 years of slavery. They're repaid by material goods. And then they leave. And many of the Egyptians leave with them. They go into the desert. And then Pharaoh sends out his chariots. And the people start screaming because they come to a point where there is an impassable body of water. And behind them, picture this, the thunder of chariots, hooves, wheels, a dust cloud. And you know that they want blood. Why do they want blood? Because their firstborns have just been killed. And whatever hell you might have been in before, it's going to be nothing compared to what's happening. And in front of you, all you see is a barrier that you can't get through. So what do? Do you remember the might of your God? Do you remember the stories about Jacob and Isaac, of Joseph, of Abraham? Or do you panic? What are you holding on to in that moment? And I'm sure all of us would like to say, well, we're holding on to the Lord. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil. That's not what happened. They panicked. They panicked. Why have you led us here to be destroyed? But God doesn't lead his people into the wilderness for their destruction. And Moses holds out his staff, and a great wind, which was already brewing, comes and it parts the sea. A deafening wind. And at that point, you have to ask, who are you more terrified of? The chariots behind you, or this wind? This deafening wind coming as a wall of sheer force to hold back the very sea. And you don't know how long it's going to be holding the sea back for. Everybody's scared. There are children. There are old people. People are crying. The Bible says 2 million. 2 million people. Can you imagine? That's like a small city. All together with their goods, their belongings. And yet God leads them through. And their enemies are destroyed because their enemies give chase. Their enemies don't stop at the bank. They try to pursue them. And they're all swept away. And that's not where the story ends. That's really where the story begins. And then God introduces himself to the people as the Lord, their healer. Then there's more stuff to this story, and we don't really have time to go into it today. But go and reread it with fresh eyes. It is not a story that makes sense to the mortal mind. It's a story that's become so familiar that we over-familiarize the details, that we almost become complacent because we're looking at it from hindsight. But try looking at it from the moment. Try looking at it from your own life. How many times have you looked ahead and not seen a path forwards? How many times have you called out to the one who makes a way when there is no way? Lord, deliver me. Lord, save me. Because you know that if he doesn't, you lose everything. Maybe your life, maybe your home, maybe your family. Whatever it is, if he does not come through for you, the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He leads me down paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And right next to that, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. The two are like this. They go together. And yet, as we read on, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. And I've been told that shepherds would do that in order to keep the flies away from the sheep, to stop them from laying eggs, to keep them safe. But you know, David was also anointed with oil. Saul was also anointed with oil. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. My cup runneth over. Surely, surely goodness and mercy follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. It's a journey, it's a path. They want on a path, we're going on a path. Another word for path is way. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me, says Jesus. So, we need to wrap up soon, but let's talk about Esther briefly and Ruth. We'll start with Esther. So, Esther, Joseph, and Moses, when I read their stories, there's a huge connection there. David too. David less so. But there's still a connection there. Why? Because all of them are royalty. They either start off as royalty or they become royalty. And you could say, well, Joseph wasn't royalty. He was part of Pharaoh's household. He was the prime minister. He had power. Second most powerful person in Egypt. Esther is unlikely. She's as unlikely as David. But unlike David, she's not in the field singing psalms, as far as we're aware. We know actually very little about her. All we know is that the king's wife disrespects him and he has to put her away because of the law. And then he holds a beauty pageant and she gets chosen. And at the same time, Israel's enemies are amassing, this time in the form of one man. And there's an epic showdown between them. And I don't really want to focus too much on this. I just want you to think about how the story takes place. I want you to think about the component pieces. I want you to think about how God positioned Esther. And again, he takes somebody who is very lowly and raises them up and puts them in a position of power. And she's given a choice, just like David's given a choice, just like Joseph is given a choice. Joseph was given a choice to take revenge on his brothers. He didn't. David was given many, many choices. He could have taken out Saul, God's anointed. He didn't. Esther was given the choice not to risk her life. Salvation will rise up from another source for Israel. But if you do not, then you and your family will die. There was bravery involved. She might have been queen, but there were laws. And there were limits to royal power. Limits by convention, limits by tradition, limits according to the law. And yet the one who is in power has the authority to amend that law or even ignore it, but there are consequences. And when you ignore the consequences, your own people may turn on you. The nobility, the aristocracy, the dukes, or the military leaders, they may turn on you. Because it isn't a fairy story where someone can just sit on the throne and do as they please. They have to hold down their own court. They have to be strong. They have to lead. This is why the Bible talks about evil advisors so much, and bad counsel and wisdom. You have to have good counsel, because you can be assassinated at any point. There's a reason that they had poison tasters. Look at Nehemiah, the cupbearer. Look at the coups which occur through history. A king has to constantly be on his guard. And marriages are political, at least in a royal context. So from the way this story goes, Esther has political power, but look at what happened to the last queen for defying the king. She could have lost her life. And yet, she chose to serve God, to serve her people. And that is a common theme, service. Joseph was serving the people. He was serving his God. David was serving his God. He was serving the people. Esther was serving. Moses was serving. And all of them were humble. They all chose to put God first. So now let's look at Ruth. And she's part of a royal bloodline, but she's a foreigner. And she doesn't enter the royal bloodline immediately. She marries into it. And so Naomi leaves the land of her birth. She's got 2 sons. They go away. Why? Because there's a famine. Those 2 sons get married. Great. You'd think everything's looking up. But then both of those sons die. And then she's left with 2 daughters-in-law. And she sends them away, tries to. Ruth refuses and goes along. And then Naomi tells Ruth to seduce this guy named Boaz, who happens to own a field. Now, just stop and think about that for a second. If you're familiar with the story of Ruth, you probably just go, yeah, no, that's just what happened. But actually stop and think about it. Your mother-in-law, who has lost her son, tells you, when you've lost your husband, see that guy there? Go seduce him. Go seduce him. And you could say, yes, but she's a widow. Was Ruth actually given a choice in this? Because nowhere do I read that Naomi asked for Ruth's opinion. Now, she might have noticed that Ruth might have liked the guy, but again, marriage is not about love. I mean, it is now, but it wasn't back then. And so Ruth is obedient. Nowhere do I read Ruth saying to Naomi, no, I don't think so. I'm still grieving the loss of your son. How could you ask me to do such a thing? How could you ask me to take another man? I don't see that at all. Instead, there's provision. There's obedience. And there's provision from the obedience. And then Ruth marries in to Boaz's line. And out of that comes Jesse. Out of Jesse comes David. And out of David's line comes Jesus. And bearing in mind, Rahab, the prostitute, also a foreigner, is also in the line of Jesus. It's a very interesting lineage. Most of us don't actually bother with the genealogy. We just kind of breeze through it. But each person there was a critical link. Each person there had their own life story. They had their own friends. They had their own relatives. They had their own struggles, their own trials. And if one of those links had broken, just one, where would Jesus be? For that matter, where would you be? If any one of your ancestors had died before time, where would you be? So God's sovereign hand is there. It's not as intuitive as you might think, not from our perspective. So when you read these stories, go back and read them with a fresh eye. Read them from the beginning, not from hindsight. Read them as if you are there and you don't know what's going on. Because the Bible doesn't talk very often about the pain that people experience. But think about it. Think about what it must be like to meet a man and his mother and you marry him. Are you happy? Is he handsome? How many years of joy do you have? And then he dies. What is that crushing loss like? You don't have anyone. You have your family around you, but then your mother-in-law is leaving. So you give that up to go into a foreign land where you don't know anyone. And then there's this kinsman's redeemer who shows kindness to you. And then you marry him. And then you have children. And have you at any point wondered, well, I'm never going to have children. My husband died. It's over. Unless I marry someone else, never going to have kids, never going to have children. However you look at children. And yet, look at what happens. So there is provision. There's humility, there's obedience, and these things go hand in hand. And there's trust, trusting what we don't know. So much trust in that unknown. Is your story intuitive? Is it going the way that you want? Well, it isn't over yet. But how are you going to walk in faith? Are you going to trust him? Or when these trials come, when these troubles come, are you going to scream, you led us here to die? Or you speak to the mountain and say, who are you to come against me, mountain? You are a mere molehill. Faith builds, it grows. Every time we see God's faithfulness, that's part of our testimony. And when you see a line of his faithfulness, and it grows like this, like this, and like this, and like this, and look back, and you can say, the Lord is faithful. He has delivered me. Where would I be without the faithfulness of our God? And then you can stand. And it is a journey. All of them had to grow. Joseph had to grow. Moses had to grow. Ruth had to grow. Esther had to grow. They all had to grow. Even Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and favor. So you are growing. You are on a journey. If you liked this video, feel free to comment. But do like us, do subscribe, do share this with a friend. And I will see you tomorrow when I'm going to be talking about Jesus, the unintuitive God, Jesus. I'll see you then. God bless.